Hi there, people. It's Dave again, and welcome back to my little podcast about my lifelong love of the horror genre. And as always, this show is dedicated to my beautiful and wonderful wife, who's decided to join me on this journey of exploring the stories that shaped me and still haunt me in the best possible way. As you know, I've been counting down my top 20 most influential and impactful horror movies from the 1980s. It's the decade that basically built me as a horror fan. And before we jump into today's pick, let me quickly remind you of the 3 rules I set for myself when making this list. So, rule number 1. It had to be released in the 1980s. Anywhere from January 1st, 1980 to December 31st, 1989. Rule number 2, there could only be one film per franchise. So if it's a big series like Friday the 13th or even Nightmare on Elm Street, I could only get one pick, one entry from that franchise. Rule number 3, only one film per director. And this quite honestly was the hardest one for me because the 80s were stacked with filmmakers I adore. But this rule forced me to mix things up and give me the list, make a list that gives more variety instead of just letting the same handful of directors dominate the whole thing. Now, at this point in the countdown, we have made it all the way to number 14. And yeah, I know there's been a bit of a gap since the last episode, and I apologize. Life happens and schedules get a little messy. But hey, we're here now, and that's what matters. So let's jump back in and keep this thing rolling and talk about the next film on this list. So, welcome to my bloody love letter. So today, we're going to have a really fascinating conversation. One that digs into the gaps in our understanding of, well, everything. Humanity has always been searching for answers, why we're here and where we came from, where we're going, and what any of it means. And beyond the basic human needs of food and safety and family and community, there's this deeper itch in us to understand why we exist at all. That question never really goes away. And when you think about it, I think we tend to search for answers in 2 big directions. The first direction is outward. This is where we look to an external force, a god, a deity, some supreme power that exists beyond our comprehension. Religion has filled that role for so many people across human history. It gives us a way to explain the things we can't explain just yet. We relinquish some control, some free will to this larger force, trusting that it understands the purpose behind everything, the universe, our existence, our path. Sometimes that's comforting, but sometimes it's confining. It's one of the oldest and most powerful ways we try to fill in the gaps of our knowledge. Now, the second direction is inward. So instead of looking to the heavens, we look into ourselves, into the mind, the subconscious, the shadows behind our thoughts. The mind is everything for us, and yet it's still this enormous mystery. Dreams hint at something deeper. Buried memories hint at things we don't fully process. Evolution has left layer upon layer inside of us, and we're only seeing the surface. So, humans have always tried to dig further. And when everyday consciousness just doesn't get us there, doesn't get us deep enough, we turn to tools, meditation, sensory deprivation, and yes, hallucinogenic drugs. We use them to peel back those layers and access the parts of ourselves that don't normally speak up. We use these tools to alter perception, to see things we usually ignore, to experience something beyond our default reality. Sometimes it's profound. Sometimes it's destabilizing. But it's always revealing. And that's where our film sits, right at the crossroads of these two approaches. It looks at religion as one attempt to explain the mysteries of existence. But more so, it looks inward at the human mind as another. It explores evolution, spirituality, science, and the terrifying possibility that the answers we're chasing might not be comforting, or might not even have any answers at all. So today we're diving into one of the most existential, ambitious, and downright fascinating films on this list. A movie that asks what happens when you go back, way back, to the deepest roots of human consciousness in search of the truth. Whether the answers satisfy you, well, that's up to you. Let's dig into it. Today we're talking about 1980s Altered States.
In the basement of one of the country's leading medical schools, Dr. Edward Jessup, candidate for a Nobel Prize, is conducting the most dangerous experiment in the history of science. And the subject of the experiment is himself.
Ask him what kind of an experience I can expect. It's deafening. The noise is deafening.
He's blacked out.
What happens during these blackout periods is you get the feeling of phenomenal acceleration, like you're being shot out over millions, billions of years. Time simply obliterates.
You guys are shooting off with an untested drug that stacks up in the brain and works in the nucleus of the cell, and you don't call that dangerous.
Now, I'm asking you to put the experiment off until we understand a little more in order to minimize the risk.
I'm really frightened.
We could be screwing around with his whole genetic structure. Now, how do we stop this?
We've got millions of years stored away in that computer bank we call our minds. We have got trillions of dormant genes in us, our whole evolutionary past. Perhaps I've tapped into that.
He may be on to something that is beyond our own comprehension. Now, because I believe him, I want this thing stopped.
The hell was that? You okay?
If you love me, Eddie, get fired!
Altered States.
Before we get too deep into the subject matter Altered States is wrestling with, let's walk through the plot and talk about how all these big ideas connect to the story itself.
Now is the time in our podcast to talk about the plot. Spoiler warning if you haven't seen this movie. Thank you for holding.
So the film actually starts back in 1967, where we meet Eddie Jessup, a Harvard psychophysiologist who is obsessed with understanding the mind. He's studying schizophrenia, but he's also doing something way outside the mainstream. He's experimenting with sensory deprivation tanks. Jessup grew with intense religious visions. He used to see Christ as a child, but after watching his father die a painful death from cancer, he rejects the idea of God completely. He becomes a full-on God is dead type of thinker. At a party, he meets Emily, a doctoral candidate studying physical anthropology. They fall into this intense intellectual relationship and get married, even though Eddie is not really into it. He doesn't really know how to reciprocate their love. His obsession isn't with romance or connection. It's with the idea of finding his original self, some primal truth buried under layers of evolution and experience. Now we fast forward a few years. Eddie and Emily now have 2 daughters, but their relationship is in a rough place. They're separating. Eddie feels like he's losing his edge, that he's becoming academically respectable, which to him is basically the same as selling out. He believes he was born to push boundaries, not sit on committees. So, our guy Eddie, he decides to take things further. And by further, I mean way further. He travels to Mexico to participate in a mushroom ceremony with a group of Maya practitioners. During this ritual, he has a violent, overwhelming vision, or maybe into the moment before his own birth. The movie leaves that purposely ambiguous and a little unsettling. Once he's back in Boston, Jessup does exactly what you think a guy like him would do. He takes the hallucinogens from the ceremony from Mexico and he combines it with his isolation tank work, and he starts pushing his mind and his body past any reasonable limit. And then things get physical.
And that's not a metaphor. I'm not saying that symbolically. Things really do get physical. Jessup begins to transform into earlier evolutionary forms. First, he becomes this, ape-like creature, a terrifying feral version of prehistoric humanity, and he escapes the lab. He ends up roaming the city and attacking animals. He kills a sheep at the zoo, and later in a scene that feels like a confession from someone who's not even fully human anymore, he tells Emily that he hunted and killed and ate a small gazelle in Mexico. He describes it as the most satisfying experience of his life. It's one of the more unnerving moments in the film because for him it isn't monstrous, it's liberating. Finally, Jessup decides to do one last experiment, this time pushing himself to the absolute brink. During this climactic tank session, he regresses past anything remotely human. He becomes a swirling mass of primordial, formless matter, essentially the origin point of life itself. A living question mark, a physical embodiment of the void he's been chasing. And it's only Emily, the person he believed he couldn't truly love, who pulls him back. Their connection literally anchors him to reality. She reaches him at the last possible moment, and the two of them flicker back and forth between these blazing, ecstatic proto-human forms and their fully conscious selves. The film ends not with answers, but with survival, and with the suggestion that maybe after tearing apart the universe and himself, Eddie Jessup finally discovers the one thing he never believed or he thought mattered: love, vulnerability, and connection, the very things he dismissed as ordinary.
Now is the time in our podcast to talk about the cast and crew, the names behind the on-screen magic. Thank you for continuing to hold.
Before we start diving too deep into altered states. And it is deep. It is a deep dive. We've got to talk about the people who brought this movie to life, because the performances and the creative personalities behind the scenes are a huge part of why this film works at all. And you have to start, obviously, with William Hurt.
There's really very little literature on this kind of research. There's some good people in the field, Tart, Ornstein, Dykman, but most of it is radical hip stuff, drug culture, apologias. Obviously, the first thing to do is set up some sensible methodology, see if we can't study these experiences under controlled laboratory conditions. It will not interfere with the work we're doing with Hobart.
Oh, what are we getting into? Sensory deprivation, isolation studies? I mean, where will we be going with the tank stuff?
We're not writing up a grant, Arthur. Strictly bootlegging, just for kicks. I figure as long as we got the use of this tank, let's play around with it. Let's find out where it takes us. It's fascinating stuff, Arthur. I think we ought to get into it.
This was his film debut, and his feature film debut. William Hurt trained at Juilliard, and he arrived in Hollywood with this combination of classic leading man looks and something slightly off-kilter underneath, which helps Altered States. There's always this sense with him that the surface is calm, but the mind underneath is spinning, analyzing, and cracking open the edges of reality. And that's perfect for Eddie Jessup. He plays Jessup as brilliant and driven, arrogant and reckless, a man so consumed by his search for the truth that scientific ethics and personal relationships, even his own well-being, are basically disposable. He's selfish, he's dangerous, he's narcissistic, and yet you cannot look away. This performance is a tightrope walk between genius and mania. It set the tone for what would become a string of obsession-driven roles for Hurt, including Body Heat, Kiss of the Spider Woman, which did win him an Oscar, and Children of a Lesser God. Altered States simply would not work without William Hurt. He is the engine of this film.
I don't know how even to put this into words, but I'm beginning to think that what happened to you last Friday night was not just a hallucinatory experience. I've got this gut feeling that something phenomenological did actually happen, that there was some kind of genetic transformation. I don't know why I think this in defiance of all rationality, but I do. And now that I do, I'm terrified. I mean, really terrified, petrified.
So am I.
I don't want you doing this experiment again next week.
We have to find out if it actually happened.
Now, I'm asking you to put the experiment off until we understand a little more in order to minimize the risk.
No way you can understand this before the event. You have to work back from the
But
event
you may be
itself.
causing yourself irreversible genetic
I
damage.
don't think we're dealing with genetics. We're beyond mass and matter here, beyond even energy. What we're back to is the first thought.
I'm trying to tell you I love you.
I know that.
Now, playing opposite, we have Blair Brown, and in the role of Emily Jessup. And she's every bit his equal. She plays Emily as a brilliant anthropologist. Strong, resilient, compassionate. Someone who sees the cracks forming in Eddie long before he does. And she's the anchor that ultimately keeps him from dissolving into nothing. It's honestly surprising Blair Brown's career didn't take off the same way Hurt's did, because she more than holds her own in every scene. She brings emotional truth, intellectual weight, and a grounded strength that becomes absolutely essential to the film's finale. Emily is the part of humanity Eddie thinks he has outgrown. Love, connection, vulnerability. And Blair Brown nails it. You also get some great supporting work. Notably, we have Bob Balaban, who plays Arthur, Jessup's skeptical but loyal pharmacologist colleague. He's a man who keeps helping, even though he knows Eddie's experiments are spiraling into madness. And Charles Hayde, who plays Mason, another colleague who serves as the film's voice of reason and helps monitor Jessup when things truly get dangerous. And I've got to mention Miguel Gaudreau, a dancer and a teacher from the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. He plays the physical incarnation of Eddie's de-evolved caveman form during one of the film's wildest sequences. His movement work gives that form a terrifying animalistic presence, all instinct, aggression, and raw physicality. And also, you should note, in a blink and you'll miss it moment, one of Jessup's daughters played by a very, very young Drew Barrymore in one of her earliest screen appearances, even predating E.T. To understand Altered States, you have to understand the two explosive personalities behind it. On the one hand, we have director Ken Russell, who was a British filmmaker known for his flamboyant, provocative style. Before Altered States, he made a name for himself with bold, controversial films like Women in Love, with an infamous nude wrestling scene. One of the first films, if not the first, feature film that had full frontal nudity for men. So take that for what you will. He also made The Music Lovers and Tommy, which is the rock opera adaptation from The Who that boosted his reputation. And a film that is actually one of my favorites from the 70s, The Devils, starring fantastic Oliver Reed. It's one of the greatest and most censored films of the 1970s, but I should highly recommend it to you.
I can tell you a story about Fellini.
I can tell you a few too.
Let me tell mine.
Okay, you can tell your story.
I was in Cine City, which is the Italian film studios, outside Rome, looking at some locations. It was pouring with rain, and I was looking at the lot, which was very good actually. And then a big black limousine drew up. And 10 men jumped out of it with umbrellas, all huddled around one character in a long cloak, flapping in the wind. And he came straight towards me, and he said, "Ken, I'm known as the Italian Ken Russell."
Very good.
Federico Fellini once called Russell the English Fellini, and Russell shot back by calling Fellini the Italian Ken Russell. That tells you everything about his personality. Russell believed cinema should assault the senses. He wanted images that were potent, shocking, and visceral, even spiritual in their extremity. And even when his films were controversial, he insisted nothing was gratuitous. It was all in the service of the story. When Warner Brothers hired him for Altered States, he was the 27th director they approached. Yes, 27th. They needed someone with a wild visual imagination, and Ken Russell delivered exactly that.
Supposed to do for my audience. I amuse them, I entertain them, and if they're bored, they've had a good couple of hours. They paid their money, they enjoyed themselves. If they got something else out of it, that's my own personal gravy. But our obligation in our industry is to entertain people. That's what we do. We're like football players. We fill up their leisure. We give them a good time and a couple of laughs. If we manage to give them something more than that, if we manage to give them one shred of insight into their other meaningless lives, then we've achieved what is called artistry. And that's bonus.
Now, on the other side, we have Paddy Chayefsky, one of the greatest screenwriters in American history. Born Sidney Aaron Chayefsky, nicknamed Paddy, which came from having a joking Irish accent he once used in the army. He was the only person to win 3 solo Oscars for writing, including 1955's Marty, starring Ernest Borgnine, The Hospital in 1971, and probably one of the most acclaimed films of the 70s, and of all time for that matter, Network, which is really one of the greatest satires ever written. Chayefsky was brilliant, combative, and fiercely protective of his work. And Altered States was born out of one of his classic frustrated rants. in talking with Bob Fosse and Herb Gardner in the Russian tea room, threatening to pitch Dino De Laurentiis a serious Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde about the scientific community. That joke became the seed for the novel. He hired Arthur Penn first, but Penn left after clashes with Chayefsky's constant script interventions. After Penn departed, a long list of directors turned the project down. Names like Orson Welles, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Bertolucci, Sidney Pollack, even Steven Spielberg. Then came Ken Russell. At first, Russell was polite, but during rehearsals in 1979, tensions began to explode. Russell resented Chayefsky hovering over every decision. Chayefsky resented Russell's improvisation and visual excess. Eventually, Russell banned Chayefsky from the set. Chayefsky tried to get Warner Brothers to fire Ken Russell, and Warner Brothers pushed back. They refused. They'd had already gone through too many directors. Chayefsky felt Russell wasn't respecting his writing, and Russell felt Chayefsky was micromanaging the directing. Russell even joked that Chayefsky didn't like the color of the paint on the isolation tank. And by the end, Paddy Chayefsky removed his name. The script is credited to Sidney Aaron. He never did watch the finished film. Sadly, he died months after its release in 1981 at the age of 58. When asked about Chayefsky's death, Ken Russell reportedly said, "My heart leapt up." That's pretty cold. Two geniuses, one film, and zero compromise.
Allow me to introduce our American visitors. I must ask you to forgive their somewhat lackadaisical manners, but I have conditioned them, or brainwashed them, which I understand is the new American word, to believe that they are waiting out a storm in the lobby of a small hotel in New Jersey, where a meeting of the Ladies' Garden Club is in progress.
You will notice that I have told them they may smoke. I've allowed my people to have a little fun in the selection of bizarre tobacco substitutes. Are you enjoying your cigarette, Ed?
Yes, ma'am.
Yak dung. Oh, tastes good, like a cigarette should. Now then, comrade.
May I present the famous Raymond Shaw?
Young man, you've flown 8,000 miles to this dreary spot in Manchuria to see.
In the early 1950s, there was some remarkable footage that showed up, showing American GIs being taken captive in Korea, denouncing capitalism and imperialism. The CIA asked, how could these extraordinary confessions have been extracted? The intelligence community suspected a powerful new mind control technique. In a sensational 1951 book, Brainwashing in Red China, journalist and secret CIA propagandist Edward Hunter proposed the term brainwash. If communist powers had figured out powerful mind control techniques, Western powers needed to catch up. It turned into a psychological arms race that could only be run by scientists studying the human mind. A proposal was put forward in the 50s by Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb to build an experimental chamber in which a human subject would be deprived of perceptual stimuli to make their mind susceptible to the implantation of new or different ideas. Hebb was granted $30,000 over 3 years by the Canadian Defence Research Board for experiments at McGill University into the isolated mind. The experiment involved placing volunteer research students inside a chamber designed to create an entirely monotonous perceptual environment. Subjects would hear only white noise, and their arms were enclosed within cardboard tubes that restricted movement and tactile perception. Their eyes were covered with translucent ski goggles, allowing only just the hint of white light. Apart from being fed and toileted, subjects would be left in this state for up to 3 days. The results, well, they weren't good. Most participants broke down after 48 hours, and none could manage a week. The symptoms reported were very bizarre. Subjects would believe in ghosts with a strong conviction. They'd perform very poorly on grade school tasks like simple arithmetic and experience hallucinations in various sensory domains, including hearing a full choir accompanying the sun and feeling an electric shock coming from touching an imaginary doorknob. One of Hebb's graduate students, Woodburn Heron, had described that the subject's hallucinations usually began with simple forms. Subjects' cognitive skills deteriorated rapidly, and most experienced powerful hallucinations. He reported that some of them had said that for several days after the experiment, they were afraid that they were seeing ghosts. The effects of propaganda were the only ones that showed signs beyond the experimental period. 2 weeks after the tests, a number of experimental subjects, unlike the controls, went to the library to borrow books on psychical research and mind reading and so forth. There were spontaneous reports of being afraid of ghosts late at night. One man even reported that he was trying to use telepathy as an aid to playing poker. Speaking at a Harvard symposium in June of '58, Hebb had remarked that the work that they did at McGill actually began with the problem of brainwashing. They were not permitted to say so in the first publishing. The chief impetus was the dismay at the kind of confessions that were being produced at the Russian communist trials. To Hebb's horror, in a confidential report to the Canadian Defence Research Board, Hebb noted that 4 students had remarked spontaneously that being in the apparatus was a form of torture. In the last interview he gave before his death, Hebb had said that it was clear they gave the report to the Defense Board that they were describing formidable interrogation techniques. Realizing the implications of his work, Hebb soon abandoned the study of sensory deprivation. But at that point, it was too late. 7 years after the McGill study was published, 230 articles on the subject had appeared in scientific journals. And hidden behind closed doors, controlling sensory environments had emerged as a way to soften prisoners before interrogation. The CIA's multiple projects funded scientific research on psychological torture during the 50s and 60s. By 1969, there were 17 experimental centers in North America dedicated to sensory deprivation research, each employing their own elaborate modifications in design and technique.
Using unwitting human beings as their guinea pigs, the agency tried everything: drugs, hypnosis, electroshock. Under code names like MK Ultra, the CIA spent 25 years and $25 million on secret mind control research. Brainwashing could be a powerful ideological weapon, and the U.S. had to have it. And when the agency didn't undertake its own studies, it funded someone else's. Thus, the search for mind control brought MK Ultra to Canada, to Montreal.
In another series of experiments, the Montreal experiments, officially MK Ultra Subproject 68, were conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute in McGill University in Montreal between 1957 and 1964 by psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron. This was funded by the CIA as part of Project MK Ultra. Inspired by Hebb's experiment on sensory deprivation, Cameron included these techniques in his treatment program. Patients were deprived of their senses by covering their ears, eyes, and skin. Furthermore, patients were given little food, water, and oxygen, and they were injected with drugs like LSD and curare to keep them in a paralyzed state. At its worst, the prolonged periods of sensory deprivation and induced sleep left many patients in a childlike mental state, even years after the experiments were finalized. Even today, remnants of Cameron's experiments appear in torture methods at places like Guantanamo Bay. For almost a decade, sensory deprivation was seen as glamorous, sensational, and ominous, associated with Cold War exploration and espionage. Some saw it as a sinister intervention on the brain. Others argued that it could enhance the mind in creative and liberating ways.
You are centered and grounded. Literally, it would be extremely difficult for somebody else to bring you out, short of hitting you over the head or some violent means. This is the whole basis of what I'm going to be saying today. I've already given you the talk now. Now we can go on and complicate it. Now, what do I mean by grounding and centering? I mean the same thing that we mean at Esalen or at any of the other growth centers when we say that you are in your body, you are of your body, and your body is on the planet accomplishing some sort of a job or mission. Now, you can feel this in the here and now, the instantaneous grounding and centering, by proper exercises and getting a consciousness of your whole body. Before one can successfully do a spiritual trip without tumbling in outer space and getting dizzy, one has to do the grounding and centering. If you're going to move out from this planet, be sure you're well trained on how to keep a part of you going here while you go somewhere else. And that part of you, obviously, is your physical body.
Now let's talk about the real world scientist whose work inspired altered states for the most part. John Cunningham Lilly was an American physician, neuroscientist, psychoanalyst, psychonaut, philosopher, writer, and inventor. He made contributions to biophysics, neurophysiology, electronics, computer science, and neuroanatomy. He conducted high-altitude research during World War II and later trained as a psychoanalyst. Born in Minnesota, Lilly earned his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. In some of his early groundbreaking work, Lilly was the first person to map pain and pleasure pathways in the brain and devised pain-free methods for introducing electrodes deep in an animal's cortex, allowing for some pioneering research. Back in the early 1950s, there was a hot debate in neuroscience. Some scientists believed that the brain merely responded to stimuli in the environment. Therefore, if all stimuli were removed, the brain would cease functioning. Others hypothesized that the brain would continue to function. For John C. Lilly, the idea of a sensory deprivation tank began as an intellectual exercise, a means in which to test which of the two prevailing theories on consciousness was correct. Without outside stimulation, would the brain cease activity, or would it continue to oscillate? In 1953, Lilly began a job studying neurophysiology with the U.S. Public Health Service commissioned Officers Corps, which is a mouthful. At the National Institute of Mental Health in 1954, with the aim of isolating a brain from external stimulation, Lilly devised the first isolation tank, which was a dark, soundproof tank of warm salt water in which subjects could float for long periods in sensory isolation. In the original deprivation tank, you were suspended in 160 gallons of water with everything but the top of your head completely submerged. A nightmarish-looking blackout mask supplied you with air and blocked any light from reaching your eyes.
As early as 1955, Lilly reported the mind-bending experiences he had after relatively short exposures in the tank. In its day, it was known as the most severe sensory deprivation environment ever developed. Lilly and his volunteer experimental subjects found that far from the mind passing into unconsciousness, a world of creative experience can unfold when the distractions of the outside world are excluded. In personal papers that Lilly had at Stanford University, there's a classified paper he wrote in the late 50s on behavioral modification and control of human agents. Lilly claimed that the use of sensory isolation, electrostimulation of the brain, and recording and mapping of brain activity could be used to gain push-button control over motivation and behavior. This research, Lilly wrote, could eventually lead to a master-slave control over one brain over another. The paper is an explicit example of Lilly's preparedness to align his research towards Cold War military aims. In the late 60s and early 70s, various publications sought to expose the relationship between academic sensory deprivation research and military funding, leading in part to a decline of sensory deprivation research in North America. Lilly quit the National Institute of Mental Health in the late 50s to pursue a series of esoteric practices involving human-dolphin communication, psychedelic drugs, and extraterrestrial communication. He definitely went in a certain direction.
A scientist makes a fantastic breakthrough, communication with another species, but his secret is stolen for use in an incredible and deadly plot.
Can you find B? Stop B. The thing on B's back will hurt men. Boss, stop B now.
George C. Scott stars in The Day of the Dolphin on NBC Saturday night at the movies at 9, 8 Central Time.
Lilly began studying how bottlenose dolphins vocalize. He established centers in the U.S. Virgin Islands and later San Francisco to study dolphins. In the early 60s, Lilly and co-workers published several papers reporting that dolphins could mimic human speech patterns. In 1965, Lilly conducted his most notorious and highly criticized experiment. For 10 weeks, his young assistant, Margaret Howe, volunteered to live in confinement with Peter, a bottlenose dolphin, in a house flooded with water. The objective was to see whether a dolphin could be taught human speech. Lilly administered LSD to the dolphins, hoping that the psychedelic would induce communication. In 1966, funding for Lilly's project would be cut off. Peter would be relocated and sadly committed suicide in captivity. In the early 60s, Lilly was introduced to psychedelic drugs such as LSD, and he began a series of experiments in which he ingested a psychedelic drug either in an isolation tank or in the company of dolphins. These events are described in his books Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, 1968, and The Center of the Cyclone, published in 1972. Lilly described his first float tank LSD experience in the center of the cyclone, that he traveled through his brain watching the neurons and their activities. The outcome of Lilly's work at the National Institute of Mental Health was a manuscript entitled Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, which was a training manual for the exploration of consciousness, describing how using isolation tanks and psychedelic drugs and meditation techniques, one could learn to program and reprogram one's mind. Timothy Leary described it as the Principia Psychologica of the cybernetic age. John Lilly took his first dose of ketamine to help with his chronic migraine headaches, and it worked. Originally developed as an anesthetic, ketamine had the peculiar property of disassociating the mind from the body while maintaining consciousness. Lilly was introduced to ketamine in the 60s by Dr. Craig Enright. He had earlier sought relief by using LSD. The drug didn't work for migraines, though it had interesting side effects.
He began using ketamine in conjunction with his isolation tank sessions, creating what he believed was a direct hotline to higher dimensions of consciousness. During these sessions, Lilly reported encounters with what he called ECCO, ECCO, which stood for Earth Coincidence Control Office, a sort of cosmic bureaucracy that he believed was orchestrating coincidences. In the mid-70s, Lilly went off the deep end, drawn to those powerful horse tranquilizers in his research to relieve migraines. Lilly once spent 3 weeks injecting himself hourly with ketamine. Eventually, several friends and assistants had him admitted to a psychiatric hospital.
Austin, it's a swinging shindig.
It's my happening, baby, and it freaks me out. Yeah, man!
Due to his psychedelic research and fringe ideas, he attracted interest of the counterculture. Lilly was friends with Ram Dass, Werner Erhard, Allen Ginsberg, and, most famously, Timothy Leary. From 1969 to 1972, Lilly resided at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, finding the ideal place to cultivate his fringe ideas among the hip West Coast scene he loved. He also befriended such celebrities as Jeff Bridges, William Burroughs, and Robin Williams.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Esalen was an institution established in 1962, dedicated to what Aldous Huxley called the human potentialities. The premise that humans used only a small portion of their conscious and perceptual abilities. Seminars such as Lilly's described how psychoactive agents or sensory deprivation tanks could be used to navigate and unlearn one's own previous conditioning and open the mind to new possibilities. So, by 1980, when Paddy Chayefsky sat down to write Altered States, the question wasn't science fiction. It was science fact. What happens when you combine sensory deprivation with powerful hallucinogens? What happens when you strip away all external reality and dive into the deepest parts of human consciousness? The government had used these tools to break minds. Lilly had used them to explore the boundaries of reality itself. But what if you went further? This is the story of Altered States, a film born from Cold War mind control experiments and from one man's psychedelic quest for truth, and the terrifying question at the heart of both. What are we really when you strip away everything? What are we? And what if the answer is something we were never meant to find? At the beginning of this episode, I talked about two big ways we try to fill in the gaps in our understanding of the universe, either by looking outward toward God or inward toward the deepest part of ourselves. And Altered States opens with exactly that conflict. The film starts with Eddie Jessup as a child having visions of Christ. He's deeply religious and terrified, and fascinated by the idea of judgment. Then his father dies, painfully and slowly,
whispering terrible as his final word. At 9 years old, Jessup decides that if God exists, he allows suffering for no reason. So to Eddie, God is dead long before he becomes a scientist. That's an idea that hit me hard because for me, it wasn't a parent dying that created that collapse. It was everything I was taught about God as a child. I grew up wanting a connection with God, even though I didn't have an overly religious upbringing. I wanted that comfort, that meaning, but I was also taught to fear God. I didn't know if God loved me or if he was waiting to condemn me. That uncertainty is its own kind of childhood horror. Jessup experiences it through visions of Christ mixed with fear. I experienced it through sermonizing outside, telling me the things that I loved, music and movies and the indulgences of my imagination were sinful or demonic or even dangerous. So you've got that on one side. And on the other side, you've got the counterculture promising that consciousness exploration and psychedelics would reveal higher truths, cosmic unity, and doorways to the real meaning of existence. And as a teenager in the early 80s, a wannabe metalhead and a wannabe intellectual, a wannabe poet, I stood right in the middle of those two worlds. The church telling me fear and the hippie generation telling me freedom, both saying we have the truth.
He's off the wall. Are you okay?
Get this stuff. It's new. It's deafening. The noise is deafening. Can you hear me about this noise? Oh, my God. The most unbelievable thing I've ever seen. I'm watching the birth agony of a mountain.
Oh, my God. Are you okay?
I'm fine. Really. I'm fine.
Do you want me to bring you down now?
Well, what happens now?
He's blacked out. These blackouts can get pretty freaky. Sometimes they last as long as 4 hours. When he comes out of it, he's as chipper as a bird, but he doesn't remember a thing.
Just how dangerous is this stuff you brought back from Mexico?
No, I didn't say dangerous. They said it was weird. It hangs around too long. And what's really screwy is it heads straight for the brain.
Well, I don't believe this. You guys are shooting up with an untested drug that stacks up in the brain and works in the nucleus of the cell, and you don't call that dangerous.
For the record, we don't actually shoot up. Eddie drinks.
Well, it's going to stop right now. You guys are supposed to be repping
well, what are you
the
getting
science,
mad
for
at me
God's sake,
for?
not two kids in the
See,
dorm
I've been trying to
freaking
get him
out
to
on
stop
Mexican
for months.
mushrooms.
Well, why do you think I called you for? Let's see you stop him.
By the time Altered States hit theaters, both of those promises were already starting to crack. Because the church, at least in my experience, wasn't about God. It was about control. And psychedelics, well, sometimes they don't show you God either. Sometimes they show you something else entirely. When Jessup uses the Mexican hallucinogens in the isolation tank, he doesn't find enlightenment. He finds regression. He finds violence and terror. He becomes something primitive, something murderous. The deeper he goes into himself, the more he loses everything that makes him human. And that hit me because I had moments like that. I had one specific moment that changed me. One bad trip. One door that opened too far. I already had a vivid imagination at that point in my life. And I feel it was one of those imaginations that can conjure wonder as easily as it conjures horror. And in that moment, like Jessup, I went somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. And what I found wasn't cosmic truth. It wasn't God. It wasn't universal consciousness. It was fear. Fear amplified. Fear made real. Fear staring back at me like it had a pulse. That was my Nietzsche moment.
And once that door opens, you never fully close it again. That's the horror Altered States understands better than any other film of that era. It's not about turning into an ape man. It's about what happens when you look inside yourself searching for truth, and instead you find the thing that you've been hiding from your whole life. I watched people around me go through that too. A personal story, I had a friend who developed schizophrenia. And before the symptoms showed themselves, he and I did a lot of, well, I'll be straight, we did a lot of drugs together at that time. And I don't know if the drugs caused it or if they just tore down the door that was barely holding everything back. Science still doesn't know. But I watched him disappear into his own altered state. And he didn't come back. This wasn't just a trip, and it wasn't just a phase. It was a permanent transformation. In the movie, Emily watches Jessup dissolve, literally, into primordial matter. His colleagues watch helplessly as he becomes something alien, unrecognizable, unreachable. They can't stop him. They can't pull him back. And that's what it was like watching my friend. That's what it was like watching parts of myself slip out of my hands.
I can't tell you how much you mean to me. How much I need you and the kid. I just wanted you to know that. You saved me. You redeemed me from the pit I was in at Emily. I was in that ultimate moment of terror that is the beginning of life. It is nothing. Simple, hideous nothing. The final truth of all things is that there is no final truth. Truth is what's transitory. It's human life that is real.
The film does give us a kind of salvation. Emily's love literally keeps Jessup from dissolving into nothing. It pulls him back from the void. And it is beautiful, but it's also terrifying. Because what the film is saying is, at least in my interpretation, that love, it's vulnerable and it's mortal. It's all we have when everything else collapses, when God doesn't answer, when consciousness exploration fails, when the universe reveals no comforting truth. Sometimes all we can do is cling to each other while the void screams around us. For my generation, growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, Altered States was more than psychedelic spectacle. It was a mirror. We were caught between two failed belief systems. We had vivid imaginations and bad trips. We had religious trauma, chemical experimentation, and friends who didn't come back. And both paths, religion and psychedelics, promised enlightenment, but often delivered confusion, fear, and loss. And that is why Altered States is in my top 20. It's not just for the groundbreaking effects, which there were. And it's not just for the wild production history, which is fascinating. But it's because it's one of the only films that captured what it felt like to be caught between those two worlds. When the search for truth didn't save you, when it changed you or broke you, and left you staring into the dark with no answers at all. Now, Ken Russell turned that into a psychedelic nightmare. Paddy Chayefsky turned it into a philosophical tragedy. And to me, it's a horror story about a generation that reached for transcendence and came back altered. Not enlightened, not saved, just altered.
Do me a favor.
Conclusion, bilateral aspiration pneumonia.
Do me a favor. Take a look at these.
What's the story in this case?
35-year-old white male, acute onset of aphasia, no history of trauma.
What are you looking for?
Well, it looks to me like the architecture is somewhat abnormal.
Somewhat. This guy's a fucking gorilla.
So, yeah, that was pretty bleak, pretty heavy, maybe even a little nihilistic. And I promise not every episode in this series is going to sound like that. But for me, exploring these darker corners is part of understanding who I am. And if someone's taking the time to listen to me talk, like really listen, then I want to share the parts of myself that shape the way I see the world. There's that cliche everyone quotes. You have to understand the dark to appreciate the light. And as much as it gets repeated, it's true, at least for me. My whole life has been this dance between the shadows and the light, being aware of the darkness that exists, but still choosing to reach towards the brightness anyway. Because life is finite. We get this short little window, and in that window we get to choose what matters. We get to choose the paths we walk down, the people we hold close, the things we fight for. We fight for each other. We fight for love. We fight for justice. We fight for meaning in a world that doesn't hand it to us. We don't know all the answers. Altered States makes that abundantly clear. But the few truths we do have, we can choose to build something beautiful around them. Even if the universe feels cold or chaotic, even if the darkness gets loud sometimes. And yeah, the moments of transcendence aren't permanent. They come in flashes, in great films and music that hits us at the right moment, in stories that pull us out of ourselves for a while. But the real light, the real thing that lifts us out of the dark, it's people. It's connection, camaraderie, and humor. And yeah, love. All the things that make us feel not just human, but more than human, even if only for a second. And one of the biggest sources of light in my life is my beautiful wife. Every one of these episodes is for her, a little love letter wrapped in horror movie talk and philosophical meandering. She's the one that makes all of this worth doing. I try to end every episode with my own little twist on my catchphrase, and this one is no different. Our existence is finite, but love is eternal. And I truly hope everyone listening can feel it and share it. So I want to quote to you from the Book of Paul, the real Book of Paul. The love that you give is the love that you get. So I'll see you next time, and thank you for listening to my bloody love letter.